Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to be here again this morning. It's good to have a chance to worship our God. It's good to just to be able to take a moment and to sing together. There's something about singing together that's just unlike any other experience, and I'm so grateful for that opportunity this morning. If you'd like to open to Genesis 16, we're going to be there in Genesis chapter 16 this morning. The book of Genesis, over and over again, it surprises me how much it's kind of written like a modern TV show. I really think modern TV shows, they really just went to Genesis to figure out how they were going to write their stories, because in some ways it's really very similar. And you ever watch those TV shows where you have, starts with one character, and then it'll switch to a second character who seems completely unrelated, and you'll follow that person for a while, and then maybe a third one, and they just kind of switch back and forth, and they seem like three different movies, until suddenly at the end they kind of all converge, and it all kind of comes together in a way that you didn't expect, and it all kind of makes sense. Well, that is what happens from Genesis chapter 16 to Genesis chapter 21. You kind of have several different storylines, different people who are all going to converge in chapter 21 to kind of a completion of the story. And it centers primarily around four different mothers. In Genesis 16, it focuses on Hagar, the Egyptian maid woman to Sarah. In Genesis 17 and part of 18, it's going to focus on Abraham and Sarah and sort of the difficulties that they have as a mother. Genesis 18 and 19 is focusing on Lot and on Lot's wife, and of course we know Lot's wife has kind of a unique role there. And then finally, you have Abimelech's wives and some things that they go through. And they all face difficulties in their own ways, and temptations and challenges. And they all kind of, you see, have some sense of resolution from God. Even Lot's wife, which we'll look at not today, but at a different day, some kind of resolution from God. And especially Hagar and Sarah's wife, or Sarah and Abimelech's wives, they all kind of come together in Genesis 21 to kind of complete the story. But today we're just going to focus on Hagar and the kind of fog that Hagar finds herself in. Hagar is a woman who feels invisible. She feels, in a sense, as if she doesn't matter. She feels like nobody notices her and that nobody pays any attention to her. And while she has a moment that seems to go away, at the end of the day, that's where she finds herself again. Notice in Genesis chapter 16, it begins with Sarah's problem, and while all of this really is about Abraham and Sarah, 16 is going to focus on Hagar. It begins with Sarah's problem that she doesn't have a child, and that God has come to Abraham and has promised him that he will have a child, and that in their old age they've had no children, but finally they're going to get the child that they've always longed for. And in the beginning it seems like Sarah really believes it's going to be her child, but then we learn that 10 years have gone by, and they've picked up and they've moved from one place to another. 10 years have gone by and they've been to Egypt and back. 10 years have gone by and they've been through all of these experiences and this war, all these difficulties. And then, after 10 years, Sarah starts to think, maybe I was being a little rash. It wasn't me. I'm an old woman. It wasn't me. God was never going to give Abraham a son through me. It's got to be in a different way. And there was a very common practice back then. There was a very normal thing that people did. It sounds very strange to us, but to them it was normal, that if you couldn't have a child, you would take your maidservant, you would take the woman who worked for you, and your husband would have a child through her. And so legally it would be your child, but biologically it would be her child. And that's very strange to us, but it was normal to them. And so Sarah says, I'm really starting to realize after 10 years, it wasn't ever supposed to be me. It's going to be through Hagar. And so they go through with this plan, but after Hagar becomes pregnant, she doesn't feel so invisible anymore. And it does something ugly to her, because now that she's pregnant, she starts to feel a great degree of pride. And, you think about it, Sarah is the master's wife. She sleeps in this big, nice tent probably, and she has all of the favors and the blessings that come with being the master's wife. but she can't have a child. Now, it wasn't uncommon for men to marry more than one woman back then, and even to take his favorite wife and make her the most important one. And now Hagar, while she's not really married to him yet, she's the one bearing the child. It's not hard to imagine she's thinking to herself, I'm going to become the favorite. Sarah's going to get punted out, and it's going to be me. I'm not going to be the slave anymore. I'm going to be the one running the place under Abraham. And so she has all this pride. It says she looked down on Sarah, that she saw her as something less than her, and she felt very confident in herself because she was the one who could have a baby. That's got to mean that God is blessing her and God is rejecting Sarah. And so this is how Hagar felt, and of course we know how Sarah felt. Sarah then felt jealous, and she felt upset. And she comes to Abraham and she says, I know this was my idea, but this is your fault. You shouldn't have let this happen. And so Abraham is very stressed about it, but ultimately Sarah is very harsh toward Hagar, and Hagar runs away into the wilderness, pregnant with a child, and again, she's invisible. Nobody notices her. She feels as if she's unimportant. In her society, she's nobody. She's an Egyptian slave who's not even in Egypt. She's all the way into the Canaan land, and no one would notice if she disappeared from her home. Nobody would recognize if she was mistreated. Nobody's there to take care of her or protect her. Even her master Abraham isn't stopping Sarah from doing anything to her. And so she thought for a moment that she was very special, but Sarah reminded her that really, she's not anybody. She's no one of any consequence until the angel of the Lord arrives in verse 7. And we're told a few things that the angel does. Notice in verse 7, it says, Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. She's a smart woman. She found water out in the desert. And so that's where she's camped out for a while, somewhere where she can drink some water. And that's where the angel of the Lord found her. And he said in verse 8, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? Right, this is where the Cotton Eye Joe song comes from. Where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarah. The angel of the Lord said to her, Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. And then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man, his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of his brethren. And so the angel of the Lord comes to her, and notice he does a few things. First of all, he takes the time to find her. This is an invisible woman who matters to no one, and here is some kind of heavenly being who has taken the time, it says, to seek her out and to find her. I think about what Jesus said in Luke chapter 15 when he talks about how precious all of God's people are to him. And that if he loses one sheep, he leaves the 99 in the safety of the pen to go find that one that's missing, and he will look far and wide and he will never stop looking. And he is always trying to find that sheep. Here is Hagar, and she has run away and she's found water, but she's in the wilderness. A pregnant woman in the wilderness probably isn't going to make it very long. He has found her because she's worth finding. Second, he listens to her. I think it's interesting. He talks to her and he says, Hagar, that's her name, Sarah's maid. That is a part of what her job is as far as God's plan goes. And so he says, Hagar, I see who you are. You have a name. Sarah's maid. He knows about her troubles. He knows about her job. He knows about his plans for her. He knows, in that brief statement, he says, I really know everything about you. Hagar, Sarah's maid. And then he asks her some questions. Now this is, of course, the angel of the Lord. He knows who she is. He knows where she's going, and he knows where she's been. He knows all of these things, but he wants to give her a chance to explain herself. He wants to give her a chance to feel heard. When you feel ignored and invisible, the most valuable thing in the world to you is someone to look you in the eyes and just let you talk for a while. Just to say, you have a voice and I hear it. And I know that you matter. And I know that you have difficulties and pains. And so he says, where are you going and where have you been? And she said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarah. They're favored people. God chose them out of all the people of their hometown to come to the Canaan land. They're important, and they're mighty, and they're powerful, and they treat me like dirt. And that's what she said. And, you know, Abraham and Sarah, you see, they are great and righteous people. And we're told over and over again in the Bible about Abraham's righteousness. And we're told in 1 Peter that Sarah was a righteous woman. And so she was, but they had troubles just like we do. And they had temptations just like we do. And they had struggles just like we do. And so people are sometimes very harsh on Sarah about this moment of her life. But if we pick any of us, we could all just raise our hands and go one by one. If I knew nothing about you, and you picked the ugliest moment of your life and told me that about you, and that's the only thing I ever knew about you, we all have a moment like that. That you could, if that's all you knew about a person, you could make lots of judgments about their whole life based on that one moment and say, they were an awful, terrible person, weren't they? This is a moment in Sarah's life, a moment where she struggles. And it's a moment in Hagar's life as well. And Hagar says, I'm in that moment. And maybe it's just a moment in Sarah's life, but in this moment, it's my whole life. What Sarah has done to me in this moment, I'm pregnant, and I've been treated harshly, and now I'm in the wilderness next to some water, not sure how much longer I'm going to live. That's her whole life, all because of Sarah. And until she ran away, she had no say in it at all. And so he listens to her. But then, I think this is interesting. After he listens to her, normally what our instinct is when we're trying to validate someone and make them feel better is to maybe, sometimes you trash talk the other person, right? Oh, well, he doesn't deserve you, you're too good for him, or, you know how those conversations go, or I can't believe that person would ever do that to you. The angel of the Lord doesn't do that. Sometimes it's just to talk about their feelings, and, it must be so hard to feel that way, and that can be a good thing, but the angel of the Lord doesn't do that. The angel of the Lord commands her. And you think, well, that seems kind of harsh, doesn't it? She's telling him all this difficulty that she's been through, and then he gives her a command. That seems like the opposite of what she needs. But think about what a command implies. A command says, A, that you have the value worth being commanded by God. God isn't going to command someone who can't obey. God isn't going to give a command to someone who isn't worth giving command to. God isn't going to give expectations to someone who has no value, because expectations, they raise the bar. It's a measurement by which you can be ruled. It's a ruler by which you can be measured by. I'll tell you, there's a lot of mucus in my head, and my words just aren't quite coming out the way I want them to. But it's a ruler by which you can be measured by, and it's expectations and commands are a way to say, I know that you are capable of this. Ever when you were a kid, you watch maybe an older sibling or somebody, and they have responsibilities. And now that you're an adult, you think, I don't know why I ever wanted responsibility when I was a kid. But when you were a kid, that was something special, wasn't it? They get to do this, and they get to do that. You just can't wait the day that your mom points at you and says, now you go do whatever the chore is, and you think, finally, I'm a big kid. I've made it. One of those pull-up commercials, I'm a big kid now. I'm there. Because you're trustworthy. You can be commanded and expected to fulfill the command. Value is placed on you. Children who are never given chores are children who learn that they aren't worth the time to give chores. They aren't worth the value to give chores because they can't be trusted. And if they can't be trusted, then they aren't really people, are they? They aren't really worth anything. And so he gives her this value by saying, I know how hard this is, but this is my job for you. Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. Last week we looked at 1 Peter and we talked about how the person who is really reigning, is really king of their own life, is the person who just is happy to obey God even when their circumstances aren't good. And so they submit to their government. They want to submit to their government because they know that whatever their government does, it doesn't really matter. They can still just obey God. And that's what true happiness is. That's what he says. It's hard. But if you will obey me and go back and just submit yourself under her hand, just do whatever she tells you to do, as long as you are obeying me, you will find that you are content. You are at peace. You have joy. And so he gives her this command, but he follows that with a blessing. If she will do that, Then she who is with child will bear a son who is named Ishmael. And the name Ishmael, essentially, when you're looking at the name Ishmael, it's kind of the idea of, I think, God hears. And so that she, in her own son's name, she's reminded God has not ignored her. Because the Lord, and that's what he says in verse 11, because the Lord has heard your affliction. And in verse 12, it describes him. He's going to be wild, right? He's going to be hard to tame. No one's going to control Ishmael. And his hand shall be against every man, and every handsman against him. He shall dwell in the presence of his brethren. He's going to live out in the wilderness, and he's going to be kind of this crazy person. And this is what to expect from Ishmael. He will not be a slave to anyone. You're a slave, Hagar. He will not be. No one's going to control Ishmael. To the mother, that's a nice thought. My son is not going to be controlled by anyone. And so I think, to me, I hear a wild man, and I think, man, he must have been a hard toddler. I wouldn't want to raise that kid, you know. But for her, it was a blessing to think, he's not going to be anybody's slave. No one's going to tell him what to do, except for God, of course. And so he blesses her, and he blesses her son. He comes, he finds her, he listens to her, he gives her the value of being worth a command, and then he promises her what will happen if she obeys it. And so all of a sudden she sees she's not so invisible. And that's what she says in verse 13. In verse 13 she says, then she called the name of the Lord, who spoke to her there, you are the God who sees. For she said, here also, have I also here seen him who sees me. Verse 13, this is the God who took notice of me, who validated my experience, who said, you know, you may feel invisible, but I see you. And Abraham and Sarah are special people, but they're not God. I see you. And so, regardless of her worldly position, and that's, in the beginning she was proud because of her worldly position. She's moving on up in the world, right? She's bearing the master's son. That's important. In the beginning, she had pride because of the, kind of the skill of being able to bear children. In the beginning, she had pride in herself, and that's where she found her value in. And she was very quickly reminded that doesn't mean anything, depending on your circumstances. Now, she has value because God found her, and he had grace and mercy and love toward her. Now she has value because he found her worthy to give a command to and strengthened her with the promises so that she could obey that command. Now she has value just solely based on her relationship with God, whom she doesn't know his name, and so she just calls him the God who sees me. You are the God who sees. You're the one who knows everything because you see everything. It's kind of interesting because literally, at the end of that verse, have I also here seen him who sees me? Literally, it's have I seen the back of him who sees me? And remember in Exodus when Moses is asking to see God's glory in about chapter 34, I think. And he says, I want to see your glory, God. And God says, you can't handle that. But I will let you see the back of me. And I was, what does the back of God look like? What does that mean? But basically, it's just, the tail end, just the, it's not the full glory. It's kind of what's left as he's fading away, as the glory fades away as he moves on. It's just the minimal amount. And so Moses is writing this. Moses, of course, has maybe already had this experience of seeing the back of God's glory. And here, he points out this is a woman, and this is a slave. This is a pregnant lady who didn't have a choice in the matter, who's maybe dying in the wilderness. Moses, he is a man. He is the leader of a nation. He sees God closer than anyone ever had before. And when he comes off the mountain, he glows with the transcendence, the glory of God. Two people who couldn't be more different. Moses is in all the history books because he's the leader of a nation. Hagar is in the Bible because she's important to God, but not important to society. Those two people both saw the same amount of God's glory. Moses begged for it. Hagar was treated to it because God found her in her struggle and had compassion on her and loved her. Moses is special, no doubt. Hagar, Moses' point, I think, is Hagar is just as special. She didn't lead a nation. She didn't bring the 10 Commandments down on 2 tablets. She didn't do any of those things. But she is just as special to God because she saw something that you and I have never seen. Not with our eyes. She saw something that few people have ever seen. And she saw it because God loved her despite her circumstances. And so she says that she has seen him. In verse 14, she emphasizes that he's the living God. Therefore, the well was called Be'er Lahai Roi. Observe, is between Kadesh and Bered. And so the name of that is the well of the one who lives and sees me. Be'er Lahai Roi is the one who lives and sees me. And that's really interesting when you think about who Hagar is, because she is an Egyptian slave. And so just like the Israelites later would after captivity, she comes from Egypt. Now, we know a little bit about each Egyptian culture, and they worshipped a whole plethora of gods. You know, they had a god for every day of the week and every hour of the day, and they had all kinds of gods. And in particular, they had some kind of interesting ones that had to do with death. And so there's one particular god, and he is the creator god, who is almost eaten every day by a snake when he comes out of the sky. Right? Every day when the sun comes up, that's what they believe, a snake almost ate him. Almost every day, their creator God almost dies. Well, that's not really a very impressive God, is it? But she says, this is the God who lives. That's something impressive. They have a different kind of God, and it's this God of fertility and life, right? That's an important God. If you're going to have children, you're going to have crops, you need a God of fertility and life in ancient culture. And so this God is a God who was king, and then he died. And so they kind of made up the story about now he reigns from the other side of the grave. He's the God of the afterlife. And he needs his sister wives, and he had several of them, sister wives, to protect him and keep him safe. Well, a God who dies and now has to reign from the other side and can't reign here is not a very impressive wife. A God who has to have this like plethora of people around him to keep him safe is not really a very impressive God. This is the God who lives. Hagar knew a lot about different kinds of gods, and she probably worshipped a bunch of them, and she'd heard a lot of stories about them. She knew a lot about them, but she had never encountered someone like the true God, the real God, the one God. And just that one experience with him, none of the Egyptian gods had ever come to her directly and shown her his glory, had sought her out and spoken to her and helped her. But with her one experience with the one true God, she knows right away, this God is something different. He sees me, and he lives. The other ones are dead or almost dead. He lives. Now, it continues in verse 14, and it says that this well that she was at, Moses says, observe. That's interesting, isn't it? Why does it matter where the well is? He's like really making a point to like point it out. Observe. This is where it is. Take special note. Pay close attention to where this well is. And he says it's between Kadesh and Bered. Now, Kadesh, you may not recognize the name, but you know the story of Kadesh. Kadesh is Numbers 14, where the people refuse to go into the promised land. And God said, the 12 spies go in, and then 10 spies say, absolutely not, and 2 spies says, yes, we can do it, but the people refuse. They don't go into the promised land. That's Kadesh. And so Moses is writing to this people, possibly even after this has happened, and he's saying, observe. Hagar was between Kadesh and another place not far away that they would have walked past over and over and over and over again for 40 years. Now, if you're walking around for 40 years thinking, I'm going to die here. It doesn't matter what I do, if I'm faithful, if I'm unfaithful, I might still go to heaven, but I'm not going to go to the promised land in this life. I'm going to die here. But you know that your children who are 19 and younger might get to go to the promised land if they're faithful. And you feel concerned about them, right? A mature Israelite who was part of the rebellion is not thinking, I'm going to die here. They're thinking, will my children make it to the promised land? That's what they're concerned about, the next generation, because they know they're not going to get there. And so if you're thinking about your own children and thinking, is there really any promise for them? Does God really care about them? Are they really going to make it to the promised land? Moses says, God was concerned about Hagar. He was also concerned about her son, Ishmael. And he made promises that he would be free of the bonds that were holding her down. And likewise, God had promised that those 19 and younger could go into the promised land. And so he says, observe. We walk past this well all the time. You've seen it over and over again as we wandered in the wilderness. And it is a reminder that God cared about Hagar, even though she never left slavery. Oh, not for a long time anyway. He still cared about her. And so those people who were slaves to wandering in the wilderness, he still cares about them. And God cared about her child, and so he cares about their children. And will lead them into the promised land if they will be faithful. And so you kind of have this idea of Hagar is kind of representing them and their children. And they walked with the God who sees. And Moses had seen that God too. And so ultimately, Hagar submits to God and she waits. And that's what we see in verses 15 and 16. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Notice how Hagar is really the emphasis of this whole chapter, even this verse. And then verse 16, Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. And so she submits and she waits. And we know by the time we get to Genesis 21, it has been 14 years. He is 14 years old when they finally leave Abraham's presence and are able to go just live their own life away from Abraham and Sarah. For 14 years, Hagar remains Sarah's maidservant and puts up with all of the things that come with that. For 14 years, as we sang this morning, teach me, Lord, to wait. That's what Hagar did. She just waited. How could Hagar wait for 14 years for God to fulfill this promise and still believe that she wasn't invisible? Still believe that God cared for her? Well, it's because for 14 years, she just looked to the beacon that God had left her, right? When you're in a fog, you need a beacon, a lighthouse, a light to see through the fog to get to the other side. And that's what God gave her. God gave her a beacon. He showed her, when he showed up as the angel of the Lord, his diligent concern for her in seeking her out. He showed her that he cared about what she had to say. He cared about her experience. He showed her she was worth giving commands to and worth promising. And so for 14 years, when things got hard, I believe Hagar thought about those things. She thought about that moment and those experiences. She went back to the word of God that was given to her directly and drew strength from that and remembered all of those things. And for 14 years, when she felt like she couldn't obey anymore, she couldn't submit to Sarah's hand as he had commanded her anymore. For 14 years, when she couldn't put up with it anymore, she stopped and she remembered those things. And they gave her the strength to stick with what God had commanded her for 14 years until the promise was fulfilled. Her story, along with the other mothers that we talked about, they don't find their fulfillment until Genesis 21. And we're going to be looking at the other ones as we go down the road. But she was able to make it because of that. Now we know, Luke 15 says, God is still seeking people today. There isn't a person on earth who isn't important to him, from the kings of nations down to the people who live in ditches and places and have no food and no real water. And it doesn't matter where you are in life. It doesn't matter what you're facing. It doesn't matter how unfairly you're being treated. It doesn't matter what's happening to you. Those things don't mean that you're not important to God. Hagar went through some of the worst of it. She was important to God. God is still seeking people. That's what Luke 15 says. He is still seeking people today. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 19 through 21. In 1 Peter 1, 19 through 21, we are told that God has placed the highest possible value on your soul, on each person's soul. The fact that his son was willing to go through so much, the fact that his son was willing to die on a cross, to go through so much torture and so much pain. Hagar went through a lot. She did not go through what Jesus went through. The fact that Jesus was willing to do so much says he has placed the highest value on your soul. Just like Hagar saw that she was valuable to God, Jesus shows us how immensely valuable to God he finds each one of us. And just like Hagar, he has given us commands. He has said, your soul is worth so much to me. Every soul he wants to save, it says, from the death that sin brings. And so because of that, he says, you are worth commanding. You are worth giving boundaries and security and safety to. That's what commands are, right? When you tell your children don't go on the road, it's because you hate them, right? No, it's because you're giving them a boundary, a security, a way to stay safe. A command is a boundary that ultimately leads to the best kind of happiness. You watch children whose parents don't command them, they don't tell them what to do or what not to do. You find children who are ultimately very unhappy because they don't feel safe. They don't feel like their parents are watching out for them. They maybe can't tell you that in so many words, but you watch them and you see that it's true. Those commands help them feel secure and safe and happy. That's all God has given us. He has given us a path with commands to salvation and a life following with commands to keep that salvation, to stay in the light that he's given us. He's given us that security and that safety and that comfort because he knows that we can handle it and because he knows that we're worth it. He's shown us we're worth it by his son on the cross. And he says, here's what we do. We see our sin for what it is. It separates us from him. It's outside of his boundaries, and so therefore it's not safe. It hurts us in this life. Sin always does. Even the things that seem benign, in some way or another, they hurt us and those around us in this life. And sin hurts us for eternity because separation from God forever is a long time. That's what Winnie the Pooh told us. Forever is a long, long time. And you can't get out of it. To be separated from God forever, it's not going to be a happy party where all the fun people are. It's going to be miserable. Weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. And so he says, you see sin for what it is, and you repent of that sin so that you can change that direction to go away from it. And then you make a confession so that all the world knows. I have chosen to accept the security, the boundaries, the commands, the safety that God provides. And I'm going to stay within that. And so that means that I have accepted that Christ is my Lord. I have accepted that Christ is my Savior. I have accepted that Jesus, who hung on the cross for me, is the one who I will follow anywhere and do anything for and go anywhere for. And there is nothing I won't hold back from him. And there is nothing I won't do for him. And there's nothing I won't give up for him. You accept the security of his commands to be baptized for the remission of sins, lowered into the water, completely immersed, so you can be raised again to new life. You know, I think if this is what God had told Hagar to do that day, this is what she would have done. She went and she put up with Sarah for 14 more years. She would have done something as simple as repenting and confessing and being baptized, if that's what he had told her that day. Because he had shown her how valuable she was. And he had given her great promises. And so she says, this is worth it. If I'm worth it to him, then it's worth it for me to do whatever he commands me to do. You were worth it for Christ to die on the cross. And so it's worth it to do whatever he has commanded us to do. And he has given us the bright beacon of eternal promise that as we walk through this life, when it starts to feel too hard, when it starts to feel like you can't go another day, you can't not give in to temptation, you can't be faithful any longer, when it starts to feel like sin is just going to eat you or you need to go back to something before, he's given us these beacons of hope to hold on to. And that's what Peter describes in 1 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 3. In 1 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 3, he says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, an inheritance that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you." And so you have all the same beacons that Hagar has. He has diligently sought you. He has shown you your great worth and value. He has blessed you with the dignity of being a part of his kingdom and the commands that come with it. And he has given you abundant promises, far greater than Hagar ever had, to hold on to. He has blessed us beyond what he blessed Hagar. And so I encourage you this morning to consider, are you like Hagar? Do you sometimes feel invisible? Do you sometimes feel that nobody cares or nobody notices? nobody's paying attention to you, remember, God is the God who sees. He knows you. He recognizes you. He has done so much to help you and wants to keep on helping you. Are you like Hagar? Are you willing to submit, maybe sometimes to very difficult things? Are you willing to submit to commands that maybe don't make sense to you or that are very hard sometimes, in order to show him that his valuing you means something to you, and to receive all of the blessings that he has promised, all the grace and mercy that comes with it? If you are, and if there's some way that you have not submitted to him, or there's some problem that you're going through that you need the prayers and the validation that God sometimes gives through the church, if there's anything that we can help you with, we ask that you come forward now as we stand and as we sing.
When we walk